The Mafia boss saw the black Maid quietly saving a fallen child during the banquet and felt his heart crack open. The grand banquet hall was filled with the sound of laughter and clinking glasses, a display of wealth and power. The walls were adorned with golden trim, chandeliers glimmered above like stars in a perfect sky, and the guests moved in graceful circles, exchanging stories and business deals. At the center of the room, Vincent Moretti, the Mafia boss, stood tall, his sharp features illuminated by the soft glow of the crystal lights. He was a man who commanded the room without a word. His presence felt in every corner of the hall. Dressed in a dark suit that seemed to absorb the light, Vincent observed the scene with quiet intensity, his eyes scanning every face, every movement, like a predator waiting for his next move. But his attention was suddenly drawn away from the crowd when he saw a small figure at the edge of the hall. It was Jasmine Williams, the Black Maid, her presence almost invisible among the opulence of the room. She moved through the crowd with a quiet grace, her eyes focused on the floor, as she silently tended to the needs of the guests. But then, something caught her eye, a child. Olivia, the daughter of Vincent, had been playing near the grand staircase when she stumbled and fell. A collective gasp swept through the room as Olivia's small form hit the ground, her cry echoing off the marble floors. Jasmine was the first to react. Without a second thought, she rushed toward the child, her steps swift and sure. As the room fell into a stunned silence, Jasmine knelt beside Olivia, her hands gently cradling the girl's head, her voice a soft whisper of comfort. The guests watched, unsure of how to react, as Jasmine, a woman they had dismissed countless times, was now the only one who seemed to care for the little girl. Vincent stood at the center of the room, his gaze locked on the scene before him. He had witnessed countless moments of pain, of betrayal, of fear. But what he saw now was different. The calm, the tenderness in Jasmine's actions, the way she held Olivia with such care, it cracked something deep inside him. For the first time, Vincent felt a stirring in his chest, an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. His world, so tightly controlled, suddenly felt a little less certain. Jasmine gently lifted Olivia into her arms, cradling her as she whispered soothing words, calming the frightened child. The room remained still, the air thick with tension, as the Mafia boss watched the woman who had always been invisible to him, now performing an act of kindness that had shifted the very core of his being. He felt his heart crack open, a feeling he couldn't understand, but one that left him with a sense of vulnerability he had never known before. Vincent stood there, frozen for a moment as his eyes followed Jasmine carefully cradling Olivia in her arms. The soft murmur of the room slowly faded away, replaced by the thumping of his own heart. It was as though the chaos around him had slowed to a crawl, and all that mattered was what was unfolding right in front of him. The child, so fragile in Jasmine's arms, looked up at her with wide eyes, her earlier tears now forgotten. Jasmine spoke to her in a quiet, soothing voice, the words so soft and comforting that they reached Vincent's chest, tugging at something deep inside him that he hadn't expected to be moved. He had always thought of himself as a man of stone, someone who had seen and done too much to allow any kind of vulnerability to enter his life. But now, as he watched Jasmine handle the situation with the kind of grace and warmth that had been so absent from his world, something shifted within him. He was used to people cowering in his presence, to others begging for his favor or fearing his wrath. But here, this woman, his maid, was the one in control, the one making the decisions. He had seen her every day, but it wasn't until now that he truly saw her. His gaze lingered on Jasmine as she gently rocked Olivia, her small hands running through the child's hair, speaking in low, rhythmic tones that seemed to calm the storm inside the little girl. The action was simple, yet profound. It was something a mother would do, something that Vincent had never seen from his own world, filled with power and control. All at once, he was hit with the realization that he had been numb for so long. He had built walls around his heart to keep out the pain, to stay in control of his world. But now, in the quiet, in this moment, Jasmine had shattered something within him. His chest tightened, and he instinctively took a step forward, not even aware that he had moved. Jasmine looked up at him, her expression soft but weary, the weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders. She was used to being invisible, to being the background of the life of the Moretti family, but now, in front of him, she was no longer just a maid. She was a woman who had acted out of kindness, and somehow, that had changed everything. Olivia's sobs had ceased entirely, and the little girl now nestled against Jasmine, her small hand gripping the hem of the maid's dress. The room was silent, but the silence was not uncomfortable. It was different, like a heavy, unspoken understanding had settled over the group of people who had gathered in the banquet hall. Vincent was still watching Jasmine, but his thoughts were racing, swirling with emotions he couldn't place. He had never cared for the opinions of others. He had never cared about the judgments of the world outside his own. But now, with his eyes locked onto the woman who had just defied every rule he had set in his mind, he felt a strange shift. He felt as if the foundation of his carefully built empire had cracked. Jasmine's act of kindness had not only moved him, but it had revealed something that had been buried beneath years of indifference. He had never allowed himself to feel for anyone. He had never allowed anyone to get close. But this woman, this maid who had spent her days in the background, had reached something within him that he had thought was lost forever. And in that moment, Vincent found himself at a crossroads. His life had been built on the ideals of power and control, on a world where emotions were weaknesses and kindness was a luxury he couldn't afford. But as he stood there, watching Jasmine with Olivia in her arms, the walls he had so carefully constructed began to crumble. The man who had never needed anyone now found himself questioning everything he had ever known. And for the first time in a long while, Vincent Moretti felt vulnerable. Jasmine looked up at him, meeting his gaze, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. The words were unspoken, but the understanding between them was clear. This moment, this quiet act of kindness, had changed something between them. It had bridged a gap that had always existed between them, and for the first time, Vincent saw her not as just a servant, but as someone with strength, someone with dignity. Is she okay? Vincent's voice was low, a far cry from his usual commanding tone. His words hung in the air between them, fragile and uncertain. Jasmine nodded, still holding Olivia gently in her arms. She'll be fine, sir. She just needed someone. There was a pause, a beat of silence where Vincent stood still, trying to process the flood of emotions that had just been unleashed. The room had resumed its quiet buzz, but Vincent no longer felt the need to participate. His eyes stayed on Jasmine, his mind grappling with the shift in perspective that had taken place in a matter of minutes. It was more than just an act of kindness. It was a reminder of everything he had forgotten, everything he had lost in his pursuit of power. For the first time, he felt the weight of his choices. And in that weight, something deep inside him cracked open. You're not just a maid, are you? Vincent finally asked, his voice quieter, almost thoughtful. Jasmine looked at him, her expression still gentle, but her heart racing. She wasn't sure what to say. She had always kept her distance from him, always kept to her role, never expecting anything more than what was required of her. But now, in this moment, she could feel the shift in the air between them. The tension, the unspoken connection. She wasn't sure where it would lead, but she knew, for the first time in her life, she had just stepped into a new reality. No, sir, Jasmine answered softly, her voice steady despite the rush of emotions inside her. I'm not. I had never expected this, Vincent thought as he watched Jasmine carefully place Olivia back on her feet. The little girl looked up at her, a soft smile spreading across her face as she gave the maid a small hug. It was a brief, innocent moment, but it held more weight than Vincent could have ever imagined. He had always prided himself on being in control, on seeing the world through the lens of power, but this was different. He had always seen the people around him as tools, as pieces in a game, but Jasmine? She had acted out of sheer kindness, something he hadn't experienced in years. He had never considered how much a simple act of empathy could affect a person, least of all himself. The walls he had so carefully built to protect himself from the world were slowly starting to feel like they were closing in. Jasmine wasn't just a maid. She wasn't just the woman who cleaned the floors or served the guests. She had a depth to her that he hadn't seen before. The way she comforted Olivia, the way she held herself with quiet dignity, it was something he could never ignore. As the last of the guests in the hall returned to their conversations, Vincent stood still, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't seem to grasp. He had always believed in the ruthless pursuit of his goals, that nothing and no one could stand in his way. But now, seeing Jasmine, seeing her care for Olivia, he couldn't help but wonder if he had missed something important along the way. Jasmine, meanwhile, didn't notice Vincent's internal turmoil. She was focused on Olivia, making sure the little girl was fully recovered before she returned to her father. The world around her had always been one of silence and submission, but now, for the first time, it felt different. She had always been the one to serve, the one to remain invisible, but now she was something more. She had acted without thinking, out of instinct, and yet it had shifted the energy in the room, in ways she couldn't fully understand. Olivia looked up at her, her eyes filled with a gratitude that took Jasmine by surprise. "Thank you," Olivia whispered, still clinging to Jasmine's side. Jasmine's heart melted at the sound of those words. She had always believed that her place was to serve, to take care of others, and that's all she had ever been known for. But in this moment, she realized that she was capable of so much more. She had made a difference, not just in Olivia's life, but in her own. Vincent watched this exchange, feeling the weight of the moment pressed down on him. He had always been the one to give orders, the one to be feared, but now, he felt a deep sense of humility. This woman, who had always been invisible to him, had changed something inside of him with just a simple act of kindness. He found himself stepping closer, unable to resist the pull he felt toward her. "Is she okay now?" Vincent asked quietly, his voice softer than it had ever been before. Jasmine looked up at him, her eyes meeting his for the first time in a way that made her heart race. She wasn't sure how to respond. He was the Mafia boss, a man of power, of control. And yet, here he was, asking about a child that wasn't even his own. For the first time, Jasmine saw Vincent in a new light. He wasn't just the ruthless man who ruled over everyone. He was a man who cared, who was capable of feeling. "She's fine, sir," Jasmine replied, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside her. She just needed someone to help her. Vincent stood silently for a moment, absorbing her words. Something in his chest shifted again, a crack widening just a little more. He had spent his life building a reputation, maintaining a world of power and control, but in that moment, he realized that there was so much more to life than just those things. There was compassion, there was empathy. There was a part of him that he had long buried, hidden behind layers of indifference, and Jasmine had helped him see it. He glanced around the room, his gaze sweeping over the guests who were still talking and laughing, oblivious to what had just transpired. But he knew something had changed. Something had shifted, and he wasn't sure where it would lead. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the need to control everything. He didn't need to be the one in charge of every situation, every moment. For the first time, he could let someone else take the lead. He could let someone else show him what it meant to truly care. Jasmine turned to leave, but Vincent stepped forward, stopping her. "Wait," he said, his voice calm but firm. She looked up at him, unsure of what to expect. "Thank you," he added, his words simple but full of meaning. "For what you did." Jasmine blinked, surprised by the sincerity in his tone. She had always seen Vincent as someone untouchable, a man whose emotions were locked away behind a wall of power. But now, as he looked at her with a softness she had never imagined, she realized that she had misjudged him. There was more to him than the man everyone feared. There was a person, a real person, beneath all the layers. "It was nothing, sir," Jasmine replied, her voice steady despite the surprise she felt. "Just doing my job." But deep down, she knew it was more than that. It wasn't just her job. It was an act of kindness, a moment of connection that had changed everything. She had done something for Olivia, but in doing so, she had opened a door for herself. A door that, for the first time, allowed her to be seen. And as she walked away, Vincent stood there, his heart still racing from the emotions that had stirred inside him. He didn't know where this would lead, but he knew one thing for sure. He would never forget this moment, or the woman who had changed his life without even trying. "I've never seen her like this before," Vincent thought as he walked down the grand hallway of the Moretti mansion. His footsteps echoed off the marble floor, but it felt like the world around him was muted. His mind kept replaying the image of Jasmine, holding Olivia, her calm and steady presence a stark contrast to the cold, calculated world he had built. It had been days since the banquet, but the impact of what had happened still lingered. He had tried to push it aside, to bury the feeling that had risen in him. But it kept coming back, stronger with each passing hour. Jasmine wasn't just the maid. She wasn't just a servant in his household, doing what she was told. She had shown him something raw and unguarded, that he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. He had spent so long building his empire on power and control, but now, he was questioning everything. He stopped in front of his office, the heavy wooden doors looming before him. Inside was the place where he had always found his strength, his domain of order and strategy. But today, it felt different. His office was no longer just a room filled with business deals and documents. It had become a place of reflection, of moments that had changed him in ways he couldn't explain. Vincent had never allowed his emotions to interfere with his work. He had always been the one in control, the one making the decisions. But now, after what had happened with Jasmine and Olivia, he found himself unsure. It wasn't just about the child, although Olivia's safety had been a priority. It was about the way Jasmine had acted, the way she had cared for the little girl without hesitation, without any thought of the consequences. She had simply done what was right. And in doing so, she had shown Vincent something he hadn't known he was missing: humanity. He leaned against the desk, staring out the window. The city below seemed distant, as though he were seeing it through a veil, not fully part of it anymore. The power he had spent his life chasing felt less important now. His thoughts drifted back to Jasmine. He had seen her in the hallways, cleaning, serving, always invisible. But now, he couldn't ignore her. He couldn't stop thinking about her quiet strength, the way she had handled the situation with Olivia, and the way she had looked at him with calm, unflinching eyes. He had never been treated like that before. No one ever looked at him with that kind of respect, not because of his title, but because of who he was in that moment. The realization hit him hard. He hadn't been seen like that in years. Not since the days before he became the man everyone feared. Jasmine had done what no one else had. She had treated him like a human being, not a boss, not a Mafia don. Vincent ran his hand through his hair, trying to clear his thoughts. He had always kept people at arm's length. But now, with Jasmine, he found himself wanting to close that distance. He wanted to know more about her, to understand why she had made the decision to help Olivia without thinking. But he also knew that stepping into her world was a risk. He had built his life on isolation, on controlling every aspect of his environment. And yet, there was something about Jasmine that made him want to let go of that control, to allow himself to feel something different. He wasn't sure what to do with this new sensation. His life had always been about maintaining an unshakable image, about keeping people at a distance. But Jasmine had shown him that there was another way. He had spent so long focusing on his empire, on power, that he had forgotten the human connections that truly made a difference. It wasn't just about control. It was about understanding, about caring for others. Vincent's gaze shifted back to the door. He knew he had to make a decision. He couldn't keep living in the shadows of his past choices. He had to face the truth. He had to acknowledge the way Jasmine had made him feel. But how? He couldn't simply walk up to her and say, "I've changed." That wasn't who he was. He wasn't someone who opened up easily. And yet, for the first time in years, he wanted to. He wanted to see what it would be like to let someone in, to let Jasmine in. But that meant letting go of the control he had so carefully maintained. And that scared him. But the truth was undeniable. He had to take that step. He had to face the reality of what Jasmine's kindness had awakened in him. And he had to decide if he was willing to change his life for it. He stood up straight, his mind made up. It was time to stop pretending that he could control everything, that he could keep everyone at arm's length. It was time to open up, to let someone see him for who he truly was. And in doing so, maybe, just maybe, he would find a different kind of power, the kind that came from connection, from empathy, from understanding. With one last glance at the city below, Vincent opened the door and stepped into the hallway. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but for the first time in a long time, he was ready to face it. Vincent moved through the mansion with purpose, his footsteps growing louder in the silent halls. He had thought about this moment countless times in the days since the banquet, and now, as he walked toward the staff quarters, his mind was still racing. Jasmine had done something to him that he didn't fully understand, something that had unsettled his carefully controlled world. She had shown him what it meant to be human again, to feel something other than the cold detachment he had perfected over the years. His heart had cracked open, but he wasn't sure what to do with the pieces. The woman who had once been nothing more than a shadow in the background had, in one quiet act of kindness, become someone he couldn't stop thinking about. She had saved Olivia, yes, but it was more than that. It was the way she had moved, the way she had spoken, the way she had done something for someone else without hesitation or expectation. It was the rawness of it, the simple humanity in her actions, that had reached him. Vincent had always believed that power came from control, from keeping his emotions in check, from never letting anyone see him vulnerable. But now, in the quiet moments after the banquet, he realized how hollow that belief had become. He didn't need to control everything. He didn't need to shut people out to keep them at a distance. He needed to let go. As he reached the staff quarters, Vincent took a deep breath, steeling himself. This was a step he had never thought he would take, but it felt necessary now. Jasmine had shown him something he hadn't realized he was missing: connection, care, compassion. He couldn't ignore it anymore. He reached the door to the staff quarters and knocked gently. For a moment, there was no answer, and Vincent almost turned away. He wasn't sure what he was hoping for, whether he expected her to be waiting for him, ready to hear what he had to say, but the silence was deafening. He knocked again, this time a little louder. After a moment, the door creaked open. Jasmine stood there, her face a mixture of surprise and wariness. She hadn't expected to see Vincent standing outside her door. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, with the weight of what had happened over the past few days. Jasmine shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what to say. She had always kept to herself, had always done her job without seeking anything more. But now, with Vincent standing before her, she wasn't sure what was expected. "Jasmine," Vincent said, his voice softer than usual. He cleared his throat, trying to find the right words. "I need to talk to you." There was an awkward silence before she finally nodded, stepping aside to allow him to enter. The room was small, modest compared to the grand spaces of the mansion, but it was warm, the kind of place that felt like home. Jasmine sat down on the edge of her bed, her hands folded neatly in her lap, while Vincent took a seat across from her. The room was silent again, the only sound the ticking of the clock on the wall. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened," Vincent began, his voice unsure. "About you and Olivia." He paused, trying to gather his thoughts. "I've never seen anyone act the way you did. I've never seen anyone care for someone like you did, without thinking of themselves. It's something I didn't expect, and it made me realize something." Jasmine listened quietly, not sure where this was going. She had never thought of herself as someone worthy of attention, especially not from someone like Vincent. She was just the maid, the invisible woman in the background, doing her job. "I've spent my life controlling everything," Vincent continued, his gaze meeting hers. "I've kept people at a distance, kept my emotions in check. But watching you, it made me question all of that. I don't know if I've ever truly connected with anyone the way you've connected with Olivia." He took a deep breath, as if unsure of the words he was about to speak. "I've spent so long thinking that power comes from control, from keeping things in my grasp. But now I see, there's more to life than that. There's more to being human than just power. There's kindness, there's compassion, there's connection. And I've been missing all of it." Jasmine didn't know what to say. She had never expected this, never expected him to open up to her like this. She had always seen him as a man of power, a man who never let anyone close. But now, as she looked at him, she saw something different. He was vulnerable, unsure, human. "I don't know how to fix it," Vincent admitted, his voice quieter now. "But I want to try. I want to try to be different." Jasmine felt a lump form in her throat, and for the first time in a long time, she found herself looking at Vincent not as a boss, but as someone who was just as lost as she had been. She had always believed in doing her job, in staying quiet and out of the way. But in that moment, she realized that sometimes it was okay to take a step forward. Sometimes it was okay to allow someone else in. "I'm not asking for anything from you," Vincent added, his voice low. "I just wanted you to know that what you did, what you showed me, it changed something in me." Jasmine swallowed, her hands trembling slightly. "I didn't do anything special," she replied softly. "I was just doing what needed to be done." But she knew, deep down, that it was more than that. It was her kindness, her willingness to act when others hesitated, that had made the difference. And now, for the first time, she realized that she wasn't just invisible. She was seen. And that changed everything. Vincent sat in his office, staring out the window at the sprawling city below, but his mind was a million miles away. He had been reflecting on the conversation with Jasmine, replaying every word in his head, but still unsure of what to do next. She had shown him something he hadn't known he needed, something so simple, yet so powerful. The act of kindness, of compassion. It was more than just a fleeting moment. It was a shift in his entire perspective, something that had unsettled him and left him yearning for more. For so long, Vincent had built his empire on the idea that power came from control, from never letting anyone in, from never showing vulnerability. He had kept his emotions locked away, not allowing anyone to see the cracks in his armor. But now he wasn't so sure. He kept thinking back to how Jasmine had treated him, how she had looked at him with such calm respect when everyone else feared him. It had been like a revelation. Jasmine wasn't just a maid. She wasn't just a servant in his world of power and wealth. She had a strength to her that he had never expected. A strength that came from kindness and the ability to care for others, something Vincent had almost forgotten. He rubbed his temples, trying to clear the confusion in his mind. His heart had softened in a way he didn't understand. He was a man used to making decisions with logic, with strategy, not emotions. But this was different. Jasmine had made him feel something that he wasn't sure he was ready for. He had always believed that feelings were a weakness. But now, looking back at the way she had acted, he realized he had been wrong. He had been so focused on building his empire that he had neglected the things that truly mattered. Relationships, connection, empathy. Vincent was used to being in control, used to making decisions that affected the lives of others. But with Jasmine, it felt like the roles had been reversed. She had shown him what it meant to care, to be human. He thought about the quiet moments they had shared, how she had gently taken Olivia in her arms, how she had soothed the child with words he would have never thought to say. Jasmine's kindness was like a breath of fresh air in the suffocating world he had created for himself. He wasn't sure where this path would lead him, but for the first time, he felt like he wanted to find out. He had never allowed anyone to get close to him. He had kept his distance, afraid of what would happen if he let his guard down. But Jasmine had somehow broken through that barrier. He stood up from his desk, suddenly restless, unsure of what to do next. He needed to see her again, to speak to her, to understand what was happening inside him. But he didn't know how. He wasn't used to opening up, wasn't used to being vulnerable. But something in him urged him to take the first step. He couldn't just walk away from this, from the feelings she had stirred in him. He knew he had to face them, even if it scared him. With that, Vincent left his office, his mind made up. He had never been one to second-guess his decisions, but this was different. He made his way down the hallway, each step bringing him closer to the staff quarters, to Jasmine. He reached the door and paused, unsure of what to say. He had never been this uncertain before, but he couldn't let it stop him. He knocked softly, the sound barely echoing through the hall. It felt strange, this feeling of hesitation, but it was necessary. After a moment, the door creaked open. Jasmine stood before him, looking surprised but not fearful. Her eyes met his, and for a brief moment, there was an unspoken understanding between them. Neither of them spoke right away. Vincent wasn't sure how to begin. The words felt foreign on his tongue, but he had to say something. "Jasmine," he finally said, his voice steady but softer than usual. "I've been thinking about what you did. About the way you acted with Olivia. You showed me something that I didn't expect." Jasmine remained silent, but her eyes softened, as though she were waiting for him to continue. Vincent took a step closer, his heart racing. "I've spent my life thinking I had everything under control. I thought I had power because I kept people at a distance, because I never let anyone get close. But now, after seeing how you helped Olivia, how you were able to act with such kindness, I realize I've been wrong." Jasmine's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't speak. Vincent could see the shock in her face, but he continued. "You've shown me something I never understood. You've shown me what it means to truly care for someone, without expecting anything in return. And he stopped, unsure of how to continue, his words choking in his throat. He had never admitted anything like this before. He had always been so certain of himself, so sure of his decisions. But with Jasmine, it was different. She had made him question everything. She had made him see the world in a way he never had before. Jasmine took a small step forward, her voice gentle. You don't have to say anything, Vincent, she said softly. You've done enough by just acknowledging it. Her words hit him like a wave. She was right. For the first time in his life, he had admitted his vulnerability, his humanity, and it felt like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He didn't have to have all the answers. He didn't have to be perfect. He just had to be real. He looked at her, his heart pounding. Thank you, he said, his voice quiet but full of sincerity, for showing me what I've been missing. Jasmine smiled softly, the warmth in her expression something he had never seen before. It was a smile that didn't ask for anything in return, a smile that spoke volumes without saying a word. And in that moment, Vincent knew that this was only the beginning of something he hadn't expected, but something that he was willing to explore. For the first time in his life, he was ready to open up, to connect with someone, not as the Mafia boss, but as Vincent Moretti, a man who had learned the value of kindness and human connection. Vincent stood in the hallway, his mind racing after the conversation with Jasmine. He had never imagined himself in this position, never expected that a simple act of kindness could shatter the walls he had so carefully built around himself. Yet, here he was, standing at the threshold of something unfamiliar, something that both terrified and intrigued him. The feeling in his chest, the rawness, the vulnerability, it was new, and it was unsettling. But it was also real. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was seeing the world differently. As he walked down the hallway, his thoughts turned to the woman who had changed everything for him. Jasmine was not just a maid, not just a servant in his mansion. She was someone who had shown him the power of kindness, the importance of connection. She had given him a glimpse into a world that he had long ignored, a world where empathy and compassion mattered more than power and control. He didn't know what to do with these feelings, how to reconcile them with the life he had known. He had always been a man of action, a man who made decisions based on logic and control. But now, he found himself questioning everything. The cold, calculated world he had built no longer seemed as fulfilling. He had spent so much time focusing on dominance, on maintaining a tight grip on every aspect of his life. But in the moments he had shared with Jasmine, he had learned that there was more to life than just control. There was a depth to human connection that he had never allowed himself to explore. And for the first time, he wanted to understand it. The door to his office loomed ahead, but this time, it felt different. He wasn't walking in with the same sense of certainty he usually had. Instead, there was a hesitation in his step, a quiet uncertainty that lingered. He had never been unsure of himself before, but now, as he opened the door and stepped inside, he realized how much had changed. He wasn't just the Mafia boss anymore. He was someone else too. Someone who was learning to let go. The office was just as he had left it, the dark wood and leather giving it the same austere feel it always had. But today, it felt smaller somehow. The space no longer reflected the man he had been. The weight of the decisions he had made, the life he had led, it all seemed so distant now. He sat at his desk, his fingers lightly tracing the edges of a piece of paper, but his mind was elsewhere. His thoughts kept returning to Jasmine, to her calm presence, to the way she had cared for Olivia. He had always thought that kindness was something weak, something that didn't belong in his world. But now, as he reflected on her actions, he realized how wrong he had been. Kindness was strength. It was a force that could change lives, that could break through even the hardest of walls. It was something that had moved him in ways he didn't understand. And for the first time, he wasn't afraid to admit that it had changed him. The knock on the door broke him from his thoughts. He looked up, his heart racing again. He wasn't sure what he expected, but when the door opened and Jasmine stepped inside, he felt a rush of emotion that he couldn't quite name. She stood there, as composed as ever, her eyes meeting his with that same calm respect. But today, there was something different in the air between them. Something unspoken. Vincent, Jasmine said, her voice steady but soft. You wanted to see me? She seemed unsure, like she was waiting for something. He stood up slowly, walking toward her with a sense of purpose. He had never done this before, never opened up like this, never allowed someone to see the side of him that was vulnerable. But for some reason, with Jasmine, he felt like he could. Jasmine, he began, his voice low. I've been thinking about everything you said, about everything that's happened. I realized something. I realized that I've spent my whole life controlling everything around me, keeping everyone at a distance. But now, After what you showed me, I can't keep pretending that's all there is. Jasmine watched him carefully, her expression unreadable, but her eyes softened. You've changed, Vincent, she said quietly. I can see it. He paused, surprised by her words. He wasn't sure what he had expected, but hearing her say that somehow made everything feel more real. I didn't think I was capable of change, he admitted, taking a deep breath. But I've been wrong. You've made me realize that there's more to life than power and control. There's more than just keeping people away. There's something greater. Jasmine looked at him, her gaze steady. And what is that? She asked, her voice calm but filled with curiosity. Vincent took a step closer, his heart beating faster. It's kindness. It's empathy. It's connection. He paused, his throat tight. It's letting someone in. There was a long silence between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with something deeper, something unspoken but understood. Jasmine seemed to be processing his words, and Vincent waited, unsure of what she would say next. Finally, she spoke. You're not the same man you were before, Vincent, she said softly. And that's a good thing. His heart swelled at her words, and for the first time, he felt truly seen. He had always been a man who was feared, who commanded respect, but now, he felt like he could be something more. He could be a man who was capable of love, of understanding, of caring, and that meant everything to him. Thank you, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, for showing me the way. Jasmine gave him a small smile, the warmth in her expression making his heart ache. You don't need to thank me, Vincent, she said. You found the way yourself. And in that moment, Vincent knew she was right. He had found the way, and he was ready to walk it. Together, Vincent stood at the edge of the grand balcony, staring out at the city as the sun began to set. The golden hues of the fading light seemed to cast a warmth over the world, and for the first time in a long time, he felt something other than the cold edge of control that had defined his life for so many years. The decision he had made that morning felt like the right one, yet it still left him with a sense of uncertainty. He had never opened himself up to anyone, the way he had to Jasmine, and the vulnerability he felt now was both terrifying and liberating. The sound of footsteps behind him broke his thoughts, and he turned to see Jasmine walking toward him, her presence as calm and steady as ever. She had always been a figure in the background of his life, someone who had never asked for anything, who had simply done her job without question. But now, in this moment, he realized she was far more than just a maid. She had shown him the strength of kindness, the quiet power of a person who acted from a place of empathy and understanding. He could feel his heart quicken as she stopped beside him, her gaze following his out toward the horizon. You seem deep in thought, she said softly, her voice a quiet presence in the space between them. Vincent let out a slow breath, not sure how to put into words the whirlwind of emotions inside him. I've been thinking a lot about everything, he replied. About what you said, about what I've been missing. I've spent my whole life in control, thinking that power came from keeping everything in check, from never letting anyone close. But now, I see how wrong I was. Jasmine turned to face him, her eyes searching his, not with judgment, but with quiet understanding. It's not easy to let go of that kind of control, she said. I know you've worked hard to build your life, your empire. But sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is trust someone else. Vincent nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. It had always been easier to keep people at a distance, to maintain the walls he had built around himself. But now, he realized those walls had kept him isolated, had kept him from experiencing the true depth of human connection. He glanced at Jasmine, seeing her for the first time not just as a servant, but as someone who had opened his eyes to a different way of living. She had been the one to show him that true strength wasn't about control. It was about vulnerability, about allowing yourself to care, to connect with others. I never thought I'd be the kind of person to open up like this, he admitted. But you've changed that. You've made me see what I've been missing. Jasmine smiled. A small, gentle smile that seemed to reach into the depths of his heart. I didn't do anything special, she said. I just acted on what felt right in the moment. You've always had the strength within you, Vincent. You just needed to see it. His chest tightened at her words. You make it sound so simple, he said, shaking his head slightly. But for me, it's never been simple. I've spent my entire life building this empire, making decisions based on logic and power, never allowing anyone to get too close. And now, with you. He trailed off, uncertain how to finish the thought. With me, you feel something different, Jasmine said, her voice calm. And that's okay. It's okay to feel. It's okay to care. It doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. The weight of her words settled on him like a warm blanket, and for the first time in years, Vincent allowed himself to feel the truth of them. He had spent so long protecting himself, building walls around his emotions, that he had forgotten what it felt like to simply be human. Jasmine had shown him that strength didn't come from control. It came from the ability to care for others, to be vulnerable, and to trust. He didn't know what the future held, what would come of this new path he was on, but he knew that he couldn't go back to the man he had been before. I don't want to go back, Vincent said, his voice barely above a whisper. Jasmine's eyes softened, and she took a step closer to him. You don't have to, she said. This is your chance to move forward, to build something different. Something better. Vincent looked at her, his heart racing. And what if I don't know how? He asked, the vulnerability in his voice betraying the certainty he had always tried to maintain. Jasmine reached out, placing a hand on his arm, her touch gentle but firm. You'll learn. We all do. One step at a time. For the first time in a long time, Vincent felt a sense of peace settle over him. The fear that had held him back, that had kept him trapped in a life of isolation, seemed to melt away. With Jasmine by his side, he felt like he could face whatever came next. The future was uncertain, but, for the first time, it felt full of possibilities. He wasn't alone anymore. He had someone who cared, someone who had shown him the way to a life that wasn't defined by power or control, but by connection and compassion. And in that moment, Vincent knew that he was ready to embrace whatever the future held. With Jasmine by his side, he had everything he needed. The journey was just beginning, and for the first time, he was excited to see where it would take him. The days following their conversation were filled with a new, quiet tension. Vincent's world had shifted in ways he hadn't expected, and while he tried to maintain his usual composed demeanor, he could feel the change deep within him. Each time he passed Jasmine, his thoughts would race, his heart would beat a little faster. She was always there, a steady presence, but now she felt closer, somehow more real, more important than before. The mansion felt different too, not as cold and distant as it had once been. Even the rooms that had always been filled with echoes of power now seemed to hum with something else, something warmer. Vincent could no longer ignore the way Jasmine had affected him. He saw her differently now, not just as a maid, but as someone who had shown him a side of life he had never truly understood: compassion, kindness, and connection. He had spent so many years focusing on his empire, building his name, protecting his legacy. But now, he wasn't sure what that legacy even meant if it didn't include the kind of human connections he was beginning to crave. That thought left him restless. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Vincent found himself in the library. He had been pacing for hours, unable to concentrate, his mind constantly drifting back to Jasmine. It was as if the world had suddenly opened up to him, and he had no idea where to go next. But what he did know was that he couldn't ignore this feeling anymore. He couldn't let it fester and grow in silence. He had to act. He sat down at his desk, the old wooden surface cool beneath his fingertips. For a moment, he just stared at the papers in front of him, his mind blank. But then, without thinking, he picked up a pen and began to write. The words flowed out of him, raw and unpolished, but honest. He had never written a letter like this before, had never written anything from the heart. But he needed to express it, needed to tell her how much she had changed him. It wasn't just about the act of kindness she had shown Olivia. It was about her, about the way she had made him feel, the way she had broken through his walls, made him realize that there was more to life than power, that he could care about something other than his empire. When he finished, he paused for a moment, staring at the letter. It felt strange, this act of vulnerability, but it also felt right. He folded the letter carefully, placing it in an envelope, and stood up. It was time. He found Jasmine in the hallway, just as she was about to enter her quarters. When she saw him, she looked surprised, but there was a softness in her eyes, as if she had been waiting for something like this. Vincent approached her slowly, the letter in his hand. "Jasmine," he said, his voice steady but filled with an emotion he hadn't known he could express. "I need to talk to you. I've been thinking about everything we've talked about what I've learned. I can't ignore it anymore." Jasmine looked at him, her gaze searching his face for any sign of what he was about to say. Vincent handed her the envelope, his hand trembling slightly. "I wrote this for you," he said, his voice quieter now. "It's not easy for me to say this, but I want you to know how much you've changed me. You've shown me a side of life I didn't even know I was missing. You've made me realize that there's more to this world than just power and control. There's kindness. There's love. And He stopped, not sure how to finish. Jasmine opened the envelope, her eyes scanning the letter. She read it in silence, her face unreadable, but Vincent could see the way her hand trembled ever so slightly as she held the paper. When she finished, she folded the letter back carefully and looked up at him. "Vincent," she said softly, "I don't know what to say." Her voice was warm, her expression gentle, but there was something in her eyes that made his heart race. "You don't have to say anything," he replied quickly, his words tumbling out. "I just needed you to know. I need you to know that you've made a difference in my life. You've made me see things differently." She was quiet for a moment, and Vincent felt the weight of the silence between them. He had never been this open with anyone before, had never allowed himself to be vulnerable like this. But somehow, with Jasmine, it felt like the right thing to do. Finally, Jasmine stepped closer to him, her voice steady. "I never expected this," she said softly. "But I understand. And I'm glad. I'm glad you're finally seeing the world differently. I'm glad you're seeing yourself differently." Her words hit him like a wave. He didn't realize how much he needed to hear them until now. He had spent so long believing that strength came from control, that showing weakness would bring him down. But Jasmine had shown him that true strength wasn't about keeping others out. It was about letting them in. "I don't know what happens next," he said, his voice low but full of meaning. "But I want to find out. I want to see where this path takes us, together." Jasmine smiled, a soft, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "So do I," she said quietly. And in that moment, Vincent realized that this was just the beginning. The beginning of something new, something that didn't fit into the world he had once known, but something that felt more real than anything he had ever experienced. And for the first time in his life, he was ready to walk that path, to take a chance on something that was beyond his control. With Jasmine by his side, he knew that they could face whatever came next. The mansion was quiet that evening, the golden light from the chandeliers casting long shadows across the polished floors. Vincent and Jasmine moved through the halls together, a silent understanding passing between them that had never existed before. Each step they took felt deliberate, purposeful, as if they were both aware that the world they had known was shifting beneath their feet. Vincent glanced at Jasmine, her calm expression in contrast to the storm of emotions he felt inside. He had always been a man who relied on control, on certainty, on being untouchable, but with her, he felt exposed in a way that was strangely liberating. It was as though her presence had opened a door in his heart that he had long thought sealed forever. Jasmine walked beside him, her steps quiet, yet confident. She had always known her place in the mansion, had always moved through its grand halls like a shadow, unnoticed and unremarkable. But now, with Vincent by her side, she felt seen, acknowledged, valued. It was a new sensation, one that filled her with a mix of pride and nervous excitement. They entered the dining room, where Olivia was sitting at the table, her homework spread before her, a small frown of concentration on her face. The little girl looked up as they approached, and her face lit up with a smile that made Vincent's chest tighten in an unfamiliar way. Jasmine leaned down to ruffle Olivia's hair, her gentle touch a reminder of the care she had shown days before. Olivia giggled, a sound that was bright and unguarded, and for a moment, Vincent felt the weight of his world lift slightly. It was in these small, quiet moments that he began to understand the depth of what had changed within him. He had spent so long focusing on power and control that he had forgotten how much the simple acts of kindness and connection mattered. Jasmine, noticing his gaze, gave him a small, knowing smile. She didn't need to speak. Her eyes conveyed the acknowledgement of what they both had discovered, that life could be richer, fuller, and more meaningful when one allowed themselves to be vulnerable and present. Vincent took a seat at the table, a rare gesture for him, and Olivia scooted over to make room. As they settled, he realized that this simple act of sitting together, of sharing space without formalities or barriers, was more significant than any deal he had ever closed. any power he had ever wielded. He caught Jasmine's eyes again, and there was a mutual recognition of the bond that had formed, an unspoken promise that they would navigate this new understanding together. The warmth of the room, the soft chatter of servants in the distance, and the quiet laughter of Olivia combined to create a sense of peace that Vincent had rarely felt. It was grounding, humbling, and yet invigorating. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine a future that included not just his empire, but real human connection, compassion, and trust. He could see that life, even within the walls of his mansion and the constraints of his responsibilities, could be filled with moments like this, moments of genuine care, laughter, and understanding. Jasmine reached over to pass Olivia a glass of water, and Vincent observed her effortless grace, the ease with which she nurtured those around her, and he felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude and admiration. The realization struck him fully. He had been living in a fortress of his own making, but now, with Jasmine and Olivia, he was beginning to see the value of opening that fortress, letting people in, and experiencing life in a way he had never permitted himself. The evening stretched on, quiet and serene, with Vincent sitting slightly more relaxed than he had in years, his attention shifting from the responsibilities that weighed on him to the warmth and life in front of him. He felt the walls of his solitude crumble, replaced by a tentative hope, a promise that this new path, guided by the quiet strength and kindness of Jasmine, could lead him to a more meaningful existence. And as the night deepened, the three of them, Vincent, Jasmine, and Olivia, shared a rare, unspoken understanding. It was a beginning, a step toward a future that neither of them had anticipated, but one that felt profoundly right. In that soft, golden light, Vincent realized that the true measure of strength was not in power or fear, but in the courage to care, to trust, and to allow oneself to be touched by the kindness of others. The following weeks passed quietly, but Vincent could feel the subtle shift in his life, in his home, in the way he interacted with everyone around him. His thoughts no longer solely revolved around meetings, business deals, or power plays. Instead, they often wandered to moments spent with Jasmine and Olivia, the simple joy of sitting down for meals together, the laughter that filled the rooms of the mansion. It was a new rhythm, one that had slowly, almost imperceptibly, taken root. Jasmine had become more than just a presence in his home. She was someone he could talk to, someone whose words he listened to not out of obligation, but because they carried meaning. She had become his anchor in a world that was no longer defined by control and fear, but by understanding and warmth. He found himself seeking her company, looking for moments where they could sit together, where silence didn't feel heavy or forced but comfortable, the kind that came with a quiet understanding. Their conversations, once limited to polite exchanges, had grown deeper, filled with genuine curiosity and shared thoughts. Jasmine had also changed. She no longer wore the invisible cloak she once did. She walked through the mansion with a confidence that had been absent before. The way Vincent looked at her now, respectful, appreciative, had made her realize how far she had come. It wasn't just about her role as a maid anymore. She was a part of something bigger, something more meaningful. It wasn't always easy for her to adjust to this new dynamic. She had spent so many years keeping her distance, focusing only on the work in front of her. But now, with Vincent's quiet support and Olivia's innocent affection, she had begun to see herself in a new light. She was more than just someone who cleaned the house or kept things in order. She was valued. She was seen. One evening, as Vincent returned from a long day, he found Jasmine in the garden, her hands resting on the railing of the terrace, gazing out at the horizon. The setting sun cast a soft glow on her face, highlighting the calmness in her expression. He approached her quietly, not wanting to interrupt the moment, but feeling an undeniable pull to be near her. "Beautiful evening," he said, his voice soft, his presence gentle. Jasmine turned, offering him a small, serene smile. "Yes, it is," she replied, her voice steady, the way she said it reflecting the peace that had settled in her heart. Vincent stood beside her, his gaze following hers as they both watched the fading light. For a while, neither of them spoke. It was as though the quiet of the moment spoke louder than words ever could. Finally, Vincent broke the silence, his voice low but filled with sincerity. "I've been thinking, Jasmine," he began, his eyes focused on the horizon. I want you to know that I've never appreciated anyone as much as I appreciate you. You've brought something into my life that I didn't even know was missing. Something real, something meaningful. Jasmine turned to him, her heart skipping a beat at the vulnerability in his words. She hadn't expected him to say anything like that, but as the words sank in, she realized just how much they meant. He wasn't just acknowledging her presence in his life. He was acknowledging the depth of the connection they had built, a connection that neither of them had anticipated. I never thought I could let anyone in, Vincent continued, his voice tinged with quiet reflection. But you've made me realize that there's more to life than power. There's more than control. There's connection, there's trust. And that's something I never allowed myself to see until now. Jasmine felt a wave of emotion rise within her, a mixture of warmth and gratitude. She hadn't expected this, but it was exactly what she needed to hear. I don't know if I can ever thank you enough for that, Vincent said softly, his eyes meeting hers with a sincerity that made her heart ache. For showing me what it means to live, to really live. Jasmine took a small breath, her gaze softening as she looked at him. You don't have to thank me, Vincent, she said, her voice steady but full of understanding. You've always had the strength to change. I think you just needed to realize it. And I'm glad I could be here, with you, to see that change. There was a long pause, the air between them charged with unspoken emotions. For the first time, Vincent felt like he had found something he had long been searching for, something he didn't know he needed until it was right in front of him. And as they stood together in the garden, the light of the setting sun casting a golden glow over them, he knew that this was just the beginning of something new. A life that didn't revolve around fear or control, but around love, trust, and connection. He reached out, gently taking Jasmine's hand, his touch warm and reassuring. I'm not sure where this path will lead, he said quietly, his voice filled with both uncertainty and hope. But I want to walk it with you. Together. Jasmine looked at him, her heart swelling at his words. She hadn't expected to hear this, but in her heart, she knew it was the truth. Together, she whispered, the word carrying with it the promise of a future they would both build, step by step. As the last rays of the sun dipped below the horizon, they stood there, hand in hand, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together, as equals, as partners, with nothing but trust between them. And for the first time in his life, Vincent felt that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The following weeks were filled with a sense of peace that Vincent had never known before. His once rigid, controlled world had softened, and every day he found himself adjusting to this new rhythm of life, one that no longer revolved around fear, power, or isolation. The mansion, which had once felt like a cold, imposing structure, now seemed to hum with life and warmth. He spent more time with Jasmine and Olivia, allowing himself to be present in moments that had once seemed trivial. He had begun to appreciate the simple things, sharing meals together, having quiet conversations, watching Olivia's laughter fill the rooms. These were things he had never truly valued, and now they were everything. Jasmine, too, had adjusted to the change. She was no longer just the silent figure moving through the mansion. She had found her place in this new dynamic, not as someone to be overlooked, but as someone who was respected and valued. She no longer felt invisible, her role no longer confined to simply being the maid. Her relationship with Vincent had evolved, too. It was no longer just one of employer and servant. It was a partnership built on mutual respect, understanding, and trust. The tension that had once hung in the air between them had dissolved, replaced by something deeper and more meaningful. As the days passed, Vincent began to feel the weight of his past decisions lift. He had once believed that being the head of the Moretti family, controlling everything around him, was the path to fulfillment. But now, he realized that true fulfillment came from the connections he had made, connections with the people he had once dismissed. His heart no longer felt like a fortress. It had become something else, something open, something capable of both giving and receiving love. One evening, as the sky outside began to darken, Vincent sat at the head of the dinner table, a place he had always occupied with a sense of authority. But tonight, as he looked around at Jasmine, Olivia, and the small group of close friends they had invited over, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. His thoughts drifted back to the days when he had been consumed by his work, by the need to maintain control over every aspect of his life. He could hardly recognize that man now. Jasmine caught his eye from across the table, her smile soft, warm, and filled with understanding. She had become his grounding force, the one person who had been there when he needed to find himself again. As the evening continued, Vincent found himself laughing, something that had once felt foreign to him. Olivia's bright voice filled the room, and Jasmine's soft laughter followed. For the first time in his life, Vincent realized that these moments, these simple moments of connection, were far more valuable than any business deal or power play he had ever participated in. As the night drew to a close, Vincent walked Jasmine to the door, feeling an unspoken connection between them, stronger than ever. "I never imagined I could be this person," he said, his voice quiet but sincere. "I never imagined that a simple act of kindness could change everything." Jasmine looked at him, her eyes soft with understanding. "Sometimes, the simplest things are the most powerful," she replied. Vincent nodded, feeling the truth of her words deep within him. "Thank you, Jasmine," he said, his voice full of emotion, "for showing me a different way, for showing me the way to truly live." She smiled, her expression full of warmth. "You found the way, Vincent. You just needed to be open to it." And in that moment, Vincent realized that she was right. He had found his way, and it had been there all along, waiting for him to let go of his fears, his control, and embrace the possibility of something greater, something real. With Jasmine by his side, Vincent was no longer the man who ruled through fear and power. He was someone capable of love, of connection, of finding joy in the simple moments. And for the first time in his life, he was truly content, knowing that the path ahead would be filled with new opportunities, new challenges, and the people he cared about most. As he watched Jasmine walk away, her figure disappearing into the soft light of the hallway, he knew that this was only the beginning of a new chapter. One that he had never imagined, but one he was finally ready to live. The days continued to pass, and Vincent found himself in a state of quiet contentment he had never known. His world, once dominated by meetings, deals, and the weight of his empire, now felt lighter. The mansion no longer seemed like a fortress built to keep the world at bay, but a home, a place filled with laughter, warmth, and a sense of belonging. It wasn't just the changes within him that made everything feel different. It was the way Jasmine and Olivia had become a part of his world, their presence more comforting than any success or victory he had once chased. Jasmine, once just a maid in his eyes, had transformed into someone whose influence in his life was undeniable. Her kindness had become a beacon, a light that guided him through the darkest corners of his own heart. He no longer looked at her as someone separate from his world, but as someone integral to it, someone he could count on. Every morning, he found himself looking forward to the moments they shared, whether it was a quiet breakfast, a brief conversation as they passed through the halls, or just the shared understanding that they were in this together. Olivia, too, had become a constant joy in his life. The little girl's laughter echoed through the mansion, reminding Vincent of the simple pleasures of life, the kind of happiness he had forgotten existed. He realized that he had spent so much time focused on building an empire that he had neglected the true treasures of life, those who loved him and those he loved in return. One afternoon, as Vincent sat in his study, going through paperwork that no longer held the same weight they once had, his thoughts drifted to Jasmine. She had been quiet lately, and while he had respected her space, he couldn't help but notice the subtle shifts in her demeanor. She was more at ease, more open, but there were times when she seemed distant, lost in thought. He knew that change hadn't been easy for her, either. For so many years, she had kept herself reserved, focused solely on her duties. He wanted to do something for her, to show her just how much she had changed his life, how much he valued her. After all, she had given him a gift he could never repay, a gift of seeing the world through a different lens, a gift of vulnerability, and a deeper understanding of what it meant to truly live. Vincent stood up, a sense of determination settling within him. He knew what he had to do. He left his study and made his way to the garden, where Jasmine often spent her afternoons. The path was quiet, the air fresh with the scent of blooming flowers, and as he approached the garden, he saw her sitting on a bench, looking out at the distant hills. She looked peaceful, but there was a sadness in her eyes that made Vincent's heart tighten. He had never seen her like this before. Her usual calm, composed demeanor replaced by something he couldn't quite name. He took a deep breath, stepping forward, careful not to startle her. "Jasmine," he called softly, his voice carrying through the stillness of the garden. She turned, a surprised but gentle smile crossing her face as she stood up to greet him. "Vincent," she said, her voice calm, but with an undercurrent of something else, something he couldn't quite place. He walked closer to her, the distance between them closing in a way that felt both natural and necessary. "Is everything all right?" he asked, his concern genuine. Jasmine hesitated for a moment, her eyes flickering with a mixture of emotions. "I'm just thinking," she said quietly, "about everything that's happened, about all the changes. It's a lot to process." Vincent nodded, understanding. He could see that she was trying to make sense of her own place in this new reality. "I know it hasn't been easy," he said, his voice soft. "But I want you to know, Jasmine, that you've changed my life in a way I can never truly express. You've shown me something I never thought possible." Jasmine looked at him, her gaze steady but filled with uncertainty. "I didn't do anything special," she said, shaking her head. "I just acted from what felt right." Vincent reached out, gently taking her hand in his. "You've done more than that," he said. "You've taught me how to truly live, how to see people for who they are, how to love without fear. That's something I'll never forget." Jasmine's eyes softened, and for the first time, Vincent saw a glimmer of vulnerability in her, a realization that she was no longer just the woman who served him, but someone who had shaped his very existence. She squeezed his hand gently, her voice barely above a whisper. "And you've shown me what it means to be seen," she said, her words carrying the weight of all the years she had spent in the shadows. "I never thought I would be anything more than what I was. But now, with you, I see that I can be so much more." Vincent smiled, his heart swelling with emotion. He had never felt this way before, so connected, so at peace. "We've both changed," he said softly. "And that's a good thing. We found something in each other that we didn't even know we were looking for." For a moment, they stood in the quiet of the garden, the world around them fading away. The only sound was the soft rustle of the leaves in the breeze and the distant chirping of birds. Vincent realized that this was it, the beginning of a new chapter, one that didn't involve power or control, but love and understanding. He took a deep breath, knowing that this moment, this simple exchange, was the foundation of everything to come. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it together," he said, his voice firm with conviction. Jasmine nodded, a soft smile playing at the corners of her lips. "Together," she echoed, and in that moment, Vincent knew that they had both found something they had been searching for, each other. And with that, they walked side by side into the future, their hearts open to whatever lay ahead.